Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is Easy Peasy with the Smithsonian. In this webinar, we are going to be modeling routines from Harvard's Project Zero. We're going to have our Smithsonian educators and some classroom teachers modeling these for us. These are usually done in person, but they're a really powerful way to engage students online as well. So we wanted to give you a sense of what that might look like. But in the spirit of modeling, we were hoping to start with a socio-emotional learning experience. So we wanted you in the chat below to share an emotion that you're bringing to this webinar. So I'll give you a couple minutes while you do that. And as you're sharing your emotion, think about what other people are bringing to this webinar and be thinking about how that might change. As we go through the routine, you become more comfortable with what it can look like. Let's see. Getting some coming in. All right, so now that we've gotten some responses, I'm going to toss it over to Phoebe and Ashley. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and then we'll get started with the routine.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ashley Naranjo, and I am a museum educator with the Smithsonian Learning Lab, and we'll share a little bit more of related resources to this webinar via the Smithsonian Learning Lab later on. But we're going to get started with the artwork, and that's going to be introduced to us by my colleague, Phoebe Hillemann.
Hi, everyone. My name is Phoebe. I'm the Teacher Institutes educator at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. So I work pretty regularly with both teachers and students in the museum. And as all of you are getting used to probably teaching in new ways, as are we. So I'm looking forward to this opportunity to practice using a thinking routine with an artwork with all of you in this digital context. So the routine that we're going to be looking at today and modeling is called See, Think, Wonder. It's from Harvard's Project Zero. And it's a really great sort of introductory thinking routine, I think, that's pretty simple and easy to model and implement with your students, with an artwork, with an object, with a text, with all kinds of things. And what we're going to do today is sort of go through that conversation with an artwork. I hope that you participate in the chat box and see what that looks like in this context and in this format. And then we're going to do a little bit of reflection and debrief about the routine and what your experience was with it and how you might see it being useful in your classroom. All right, so if that sounds good, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And you should be seeing an artwork up there. And what I'm going to do is give you all a minute just of close looking, and I'm going to use the Zoom, the Learning Lab, to get really close to some details. And this looking time I find is really important whenever I'm teaching with an artwork, or if you're teaching with an artwork in the classroom. And I know that, wait time can feel uncomfortable sometimes, especially if we're not used to it, and especially in this sort of strange digital context where you're maybe not seeing people's faces. But I think it's really important to give everyone that time just to look silently before we jump in. So I'm going to encourage you just to take a close look now before I give you your first prompt. And I'm going to zoom in a bit, and I'm going to slowly move around the artwork. And just take this moment to look and sort of take in what you're seeing. Okay, I'm going to zoom back out so we can see the whole image again. And for this routine, I'd really like to start by just talking about what we see before we get into what we think and what we wonder. So I'm going to invite you in just a moment to share what you're seeing in the chat box. And just a point of clarification, when I say, what do you see? What I'm really talking about is things that you can point to in the artwork. For instance, if you see a smile on somebody's face, that's something that you see. But if you say, I see happiness, that's more of an inference. And that's what we'll be getting to in the think portion of the routine. So some of the things you might see would include people, objects, elements of nature. You could also think about colors that you see, or shapes or lines. Those are all fair game as well. You might also think about what you don't see. So please go ahead and start sharing in the chat box anything that you're seeing in this artwork. I'll give you just a few minutes to respond. And Ashley, if you have anything that you're seeing, we can sort of have a conversation here as well.
Sure. So I noticed, especially when you said kind of shapes or lines, I noticed a little bit of a zigzag that points up, and it looks like the steps kind of lead up to something else.
Yes, absolutely. So we see steps that are sort of, you said, sort of leading your eye up in a zigzag pattern. Mm-hmm. Excellent. All right. See, we're getting some comments in the chat box. Let's see, Allison or Ashley, would one of you want to read some of those out?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So some of the things we're seeing, Claudia is seeing clothes on a line. Adam is seeing several women, light drying laundry. Tess is seeing women and children. Jennifer's seeing a colorful home, a mansion on a hill. Trevor's seeing steps in a hill. Emily is seeing 2 large homes in the upper left part of the composition. Christine is seeing people connecting and conversing. Heather says there's a young girl near an adult at the bottom right.
Okay, excellent. There's a lot going on here. We're doing a great job of noting all of that. So we've talked about the people, we've got women and children that we mentioned, and we talked about different types of buildings. So we've got those 2 large homes up in the top left corner, and then this sort of what looks like maybe shared housing in the foreground. And we talked about sort of groups of people that look like they're talking, conversing. And we also talked about the use of color. So great observations. See, Stephanie said, looks like mostly women and children. Do you see any men? So that's a great example of maybe what we don't see. I don't see any men in this painting. It looks like it's women and children. There may be a young boy or 2, but no adult men that I can see.
I also see a few pets too. I noticed, especially in the foreground with the first pair of people kind of at the bottom of the steps there, it looks like it's maybe a white cat. Is that?
Yes, and I'm going to zoom in on that detail. Yeah, so looks like there's a white cat in the foreground right there. Excellent. Anything else that people are noticing? Let's see.
Michelle's noticing that there are many lines. There's railings and porches and laundry and electrical.
Yeah, absolutely. So once we start looking for lines, we start kind of seeing them everywhere in this painting, right? And that goes back to Ashley's comment about the zigzagging. So we've got the lines in the steps, the lines in the railings, the lines from the clothesline. So all these different types of lines created by different objects in the painting. Excellent. Okay. See muted colors, plants. Looking at the women's clothing, Claudia is saying that they're mostly the same. Interesting.
Yeah, to build off of what Claudia was saying too, I think the clothing to me looks fairly simple. They're kind of simple muted colors, mostly all one color on the shirt or on the skirt. And perhaps from a few decades ago, they don't look like kind of everyday clothing that I would wear today personally.
Okay. So Ashley, your comment is a perfect transition, I think, into the what do we think part of the routine. So once we've sort of taken stock of what's going on in the image for several minutes, then we can move from what do you see to what do you think is going on. So Ashley was sort of making the interpretation there that maybe this painting takes place in the past because the clothing doesn't look like something we would wear today. So I'm really curious to hear what everyone else thinks about what's going on here. So feel free to jump in the chat box. What are you thinking about when looking at this painting?
So for me, it looks like kind of an everyday scene, I guess. It's not a big celebration, nothing fancy. People look like they might be outside of their homes or in their neighborhood.
Okay, great. So kind of an ordinary everyday scene. And our visual evidence for that is kind of the clothing that seems pretty ordinary, and maybe the activities that are going on as well, the laundry and the gathering.
So we have some other comments about that. It looks like a high density building. Makes me think of the Caribbean. Emily's wondering if there's staff for the people in larger homes. Trevor's wondering, he says he thinks it's an older time and the men are not doing laundry. Jennifer's noticing maybe there's no electricity.
Okay.
And Emily had a comment earlier that she infers that the people in this painting may be working class based on the labor they're doing and their clothing.
Okay, great. So starting to think about class, it sounds like, based on the clothing and the labor, and also thinking about maybe the class differences that might be implied based on the two types of housing that we see in the painting, and wondering about how those two spaces connect. Hearing these thoughts about are these women working and doing laundry for the people who live in the houses up the hill? And then let's see. No, I liked the observation of no electricity, because we see everybody hanging their laundry out the window. So that seems to imply that maybe they don't have an electric dryer inside like we might have today. So that helps us figure out the time period as well, or at least whether this is present day. Great.
Veronica's also noticing that she thinks that there's a general unrushed mood. Some of the women and their postures and the clothes hanging, there's no wind and not a lot of movement.
Interesting. So there's no sense of urgency, maybe, or maybe it's just more of like a laid back, calm feeling. Excellent.
Mm-hmm. And Sandy's noticing that it's about class, but there's a gendered image of work and community that we're also noticing.
Yeah, absolutely. So this question of where are the men, right? The women seem to be doing all of the laundry, and they're the ones being highlighted in this image. So what would the painting look like of what the men in their lives are doing right now? We don't know. Great comment from Claudia. She says, in most countries in Europe, there's electricity, but there are no clothes dryers. So that's a great point about my comment earlier, just because there are no clothes dryers doesn't mean that it's not the present day. But maybe putting it together with some of the other visual clues we've gotten, we can infer that.
And Paula and Stephanie are noticing that the type of laundry seems to be beddings and towels and sheets and not as many articles of clothing.
Okay, interesting. Great. All right. Well, I feel like we could go on with what we think we see and what's going on in here for much longer, because the closer we look, the more we can always find with this painting. And I always find things too that I didn't notice the first time. But I want to move us now into that final piece of the See, Think, Wonder. So I'll ask, what does this painting make you wonder? What are you curious to learn more about? And feel free to add those wonders in the chat box.
For me, Phoebe, I'll kind of get us started. This artwork kind of seems like a snapshot, a single moment in time. And so I'm always curious what happened to the people before and after this snapshot.
That's a great question. That could be a really interesting writing prompt too for students, like what was going on just before this moment and what could happen after. Imagining it's one scene in a story. I love that.
So Adam is wondering about the languages being spoken. And Philippa is wondering if this is a special day or is it every day. Okay. Stephanie's wondering how many people live here. And Paula's wondering whose point of view this is.
Great questions.
Another thing I was thinking about too is, this is a visual art piece, but I'm kind of curious what the sounds would be like in this artwork. If we could kind of turn on the volume for this artwork, what would we be hearing?
Yeah, I love that question. I feel like it could be very sensory, right? We can imagine a lot of sound and maybe even smells.
Christine is wondering what schooling might be like for the children who are there. Jennifer's wondering how they were able to hang the laundry up so high and what the artist intended by that. Trevor is wondering how they remember which blankets belong to which people. So there's some logistical wonders that are happening. Kelly's wondering who the figure is in the top left corner. They're walking alone up the hill and is wondering if they belong to the community below.
Let's zoom in on that. Oops. Oh, there we go. So we're looking at that figure up in the top left, going up the hill right there. Sort of the one figure that we see in that upper left corner of the painting with those larger Victorian houses. Great question. I see Stephanie has a question about what surrounds this housing. Is it other houses or places of work? So if we could, that's another great question for students to consider. If we could zoom out and see what was outside of the frame in this painting, what might we see? Really interesting question.
Stephanie was also wondering how the feeling would change if the point of view was from above looking down rather from down looking up.
Right. And what does it say that the artist chose this particular perspective, right?
And Sandy's wondering, building on that, is looking at the big houses on top, what's the relationship between the women in these houses? Lindsay's wondering who built the buildings and who might have been the architect.
Right.
And I think
questions.
Yeah, that connects earlier to Stephanie was saying that there was thinking that their clothes might be an indication of where they are. So I think the thinking of the architecture might also connect with that. And Sandy's wondering what season it is. Is it summer? What time of day?
Yeah. Excellent.
I'm curious too about the artist's motivations for painting what to me seems like a fairly kind of everyday, somewhat mundane scene. Just kind of interesting to think about what might have motivated the artist to paint such a scene.
Yeah. So starting to think like move outside of the artwork and thinking about the artist who created it and wondering a little bit about their motivations, their purpose. See, Paula has a question about, is this a typical composition from the artist to lead the eye up and down, zigzagging up the image? That's a great question about stylistic choices and composition that the artist made. And, you know, I think, you know, thinking about intentionality, artists are very aware generally of how they can lead your eye around a painting. So even if that particular composition isn't found in every, you know, in a ton of paintings, choices about how to lead your eye around the painting certainly are. It's a great observation. All right. And Stephanie is wondering how my ideas about this image would change if I had access to historic photographs, maps, and writings from people who live there. Excellent question. So I think that kind of leads us really well sort of into a reflection about the routine and maybe where we could go from there. So thank you all, first of all, for participating in this See-Think Wonder. This is really exciting to see all of your thoughts coming in. One of the things that I like to ask once we finish the wonder, especially with teachers, is where could we go from these wonders? How could we build on some of those authentic questions that we've generated? And I think that can be a really great jumping off point into research that your students could do now that they're curious and motivated to find the answers. And just to share like a really brief bit of information with you, the title of this painting is Tenement Flats. It's created by an artist named Millard Sheets. And it was made in, I believe, 1933 to 1934. So this painting is depicting a neighborhood called Bunker Hill in Los Angeles. And this, you know, being made in 1933 and 1934, if you know your American history, this is right in the middle of the Great Depression. And Millard Sheets was part of the Public Works of Art Project, which was the first New Deal program that funded artists to make art during the Depression to sort of stimulate the economy. So what I would do if we had a ton of time with students is share that bit of information and then continue the discussion and have that context. You know, what new wonders do you have? What are you thinking now? How has your thinking changed? So that can be a really great, you know, way to extend the conversation. And I like to always think of sharing that background not as sort of an end to the conversation, but an extension of it. Great. So just to think about, step back for a minute and think about the routine that we did. I just want to ask you all to think for a moment about your own thinking during this process of the See-Think Wonder. And maybe you can just share in the chat box, what are some of the types of thinking that you think you did?
I can start us off, Phoebe. One thing that I was thinking about was how, when you facilitated that for us, I had kind of anticipated the think, and so you helped me kind of see how I could distinguish between, you know, what I saw and what I started to kind of make an interpretation about or think about in the artwork. And so I really appreciated that time where I had that opportunity to differentiate between what I was seeing and what I was thinking about that.
Great. Yeah. So we sort of have this observation interpretation piece, and then we have this reasoning and inferring piece that's separate in the routine. So it really it draws your attention to what is the difference between what we see and what we infer. Great. Obviously one of the other types of thinking we did was questioning, and that could lead into investigating for your students. So once they have these questions, how could they investigate further to find out the answers?
Tess said she found she spent a lot of time looking closely for details. Claudia said she's sharing close observations and adding on to them. Stephanie said it helped her think about fact versus inference.
Great. Excellent.
Paula said analyzing, comparing, making connections.
Yes, absolutely.
I thought too, one of the kind of great strengths of the way that we just did this is, of course, I saw a few things myself during the time that you were zooming around the page and kind of helping us scan the image. But I think a lot of my better observations, my more interesting ones, had built on other people's observations. And so they kind of spurred my thinking, and by listening and also contributing, it was kind of an interesting communal experience.
Yeah, and I think that's really key to the success of these routines. I think they're so much more powerful when we do them as a group, because we can, my interpretation might not be the same as yours, but once we hear each other's, we can learn from one another and sort of get exposed to different perspectives beyond our own, and that can be really valuable. Great. Another one that comes to mind for me is sort of the idea of revision of thought, especially once we share some context about the artwork. It's really helpful for me to be able to go back and say, here's what I thought before, here's what I think now, and this is why a change happened. And I think it's really useful for your students to be able to practice that skill as well.
And A. King was saying that she loves the idea of using this as a springboard for students to start to dig into their own topic or context.
Great.
I had an additional wonder, Phoebe, too, so obviously we're all adults or caregivers or educators that are participating in this session, and really kind of dug in deep with just one single artwork. But I'm curious if there were different age groups involved. Are there ways to kind of differentiate this? Would this routine work with other objects in the collection?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So I've used this routine with everything from like a first grader up through adults, and it works really well. I think the choice of artwork or object that you'd use would be maybe different if you're working with first graders versus 12th graders. And you might need to do a little bit more scaffolding with younger learners, or really any age students who aren't used to looking at artwork or having these types of conversations. I think in the classroom, what I would do always is document RC Think Wonder, and that can be really helpful, especially if you have English language learners in your classroom, to sort of link the words to the images. Can be a really powerful way to solidify vocabulary and help sort of even the playing field as much as possible. Great question. So I know we just have a minute or so left. I wanted to make sure we show the collection that you can access. Ashley, I don't know if you want to talk about the Learning Lab collection at all.
Sure. So by visiting the Learning Lab, which is learninglab.si.edu, it's also in the description of this video too. So you have a link to it. We've curated a number of digital resources for you. So there's actually a team of us who have been thinking about how to pair a thinking routine that's seemingly simple but research-based. It's from Harvard Graduate School of Education's Project Zero, with an artwork from the museum's collection. And so Phoebe has joined us from the Smithsonian American Art Museum and chose this as an example. But this is the type of routine that could be done with any artwork. And you heard kind of some tips on how to differentiate. We've also provided some context and background from both Project Zero about the thinking routines, as well as some kind of context and background about the artwork itself. So there's this great video from our friends at Smart History that you can watch to get a little bit more context about the artwork itself. Phoebe also did a great job of providing 3 examples of teachers who have actually used this artwork in lessons that have gone a little bit deeper. So you can take a look at that. And then, of course, the archived recording of the webinar is also available here, along with some additional professional development resources. So this collection can really serve as a model for you as you're thinking about how to facilitate this type of learning and thinking with your own students.
We do have a couple of questions in the chat. Let's see. Heather said she'd be interested in knowing how this would go with a class of 20 or 25 and some ideas for managing that.
Yeah, great question. So I would say if it becomes too many voices all at once, a great thing that you can do is have your students pair up and maybe do like a pair share kind of thing so that everybody feels like they get to share their thoughts, and then maybe have those smaller groups share out to the large group, so that everybody gets to talk, but you still you sort of don't have this overwhelming number of voices all at once. In a digital context, I'm not sure what the best way to facilitate that would be, but you could also think about having your students write down their C's in advance of the conversation. It could be another way to sort of collect a lot of voices without having too much going on all at once. So those are just a couple ideas off the top of my head.
That kind of piggybacks nicely into Kelly's question about, are there modifications you would do to facilitating a thinking routine with artwork online versus in person in a classroom or gallery?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that we're all still trying to figure out. One of the great things that you can do with online is that Zoom feature. You can get closer than honestly you could get in the gallery. So that's really nice to be able to show your students those details. And another really cool way that you could have your students look at an image digitally is you could actually reveal different parts of the artwork at a time. So what I've done before is cover up like 2/3 of the artwork and only show them 1/3 of it at one time, and then gradually reveal more. So that can be a really helpful way to focus looking, and it sort of creates this excitement and feeling of suspense because students want to know what's coming next. In person is great. It's hard to replicate the experience of seeing artwork in person, but there's a lot that you can do digitally that you can't do in person. So I would say just think about what are the benefits of the medium you're using.
And Emily had a question about if this technique this routine can be applied to non-art or design objects or some other kind of object.
Absolutely, yes. I think if there are particular features of a design or object that you want your students to do a See, Think, Wonder with, that you maybe want to introduce to them so that they have the vocabulary, that might be helpful scaffolding. But I've used See, Think, Wonder with literally almost every kind of object. And it's endlessly flexible in my experience.
One thing I thought about too, there was some questions about the digital context versus the physical. And I love how Phoebe framed it that, think about what the benefits are of this medium too, is something that Stephanie mentioned in the chat box about sending the image in advance. And so having some time for the students to process kind of asynchronously. So they're doing it by themselves and then bringing some of their thoughts to the conversation as a whole. So they've done a little bit of thinking and planning along the way. So I think there's a lot of options and flexibility also with the tools that we're given right now in terms of digital context too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and I think the benefit of the chat box too is it allows those students who need a little more processing time or some time to gather their thoughts, the time to do it so they're not quite as on the spot.
I will say too, I find myself at the dinner table doing this with objects that are in the house, and all the time, folks that I live with are always asking, "Are you doing a thinking routine with me right now?" So you'll find that it works with objects in the museum's collection, but also with things, anything that's of interest.
Well, and that's part of their design, right? They're meant to become a habit of mind. So it shows that they're working if you're using them with objects at your dinner table, I'd say.
Well, I think the questions have slowed. So I think, why don't we close with returning to that question that we started at the beginning. So we asked you what emotion you were coming into the webinar with. So if you just take a minute in the chat and type the emotion you're leaving the webinar with. Some of the emotions we heard were anxious, excited, inspired. So a lot of positive, engaged, curiosity. So it's interesting to hear, thinking about how did going through this routine change how you're feeling, and making that observation for you and for your colleagues online. And we wanted to let you know, so Phoebe will be with us again at Wednesday at 1. We're going to be doing another See, Think, Wonder with a different artwork, but it's an opportunity both to see how the routine works with a different artwork, but also if you have the opportunity to try this out with your students or with someone, then you can come back and talk about what your experience was like and share that with the group as well. So we'd really love to hear that.
And Allison, that's this Wednesday, right? April 1st?
Yep, this Wednesday, April 1st. That's right.
Great.
Yeah, so in 2 days. And this webinar will be archived, like Ashley said, in the Learning Lab collection, which I put the link to that in the chat. And you can also find other resources available at our learninglab.si.edu/distance learning. It's where we're collecting resources from across the Smithsonian's 19 museums, National Zoo, archives, and libraries for teachers and caregivers in this particular time of where many of us are distant learning at the moment. So we wanted to thank you for joining us. We hope to see you again on Wednesday. And thank you for your participation.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.